Now, let's keep the positive energy going, ladies and gentlemen, as I introduce our next speaker. As we know, the federal government has a critical city-shaping role to play, and their relationship with other levels of government is also crucial, especially at the state level. So it seemed only fitting that we invite the person who's largely responsible for advocacy in the federal parliament to join us today. The Minister will provide us with some scene-setting remarks and then enjoy a fireside chat with the Dialogue's Adam Leto to unpack some of those issues. And of course, the stage is our metaphoric fire pit. So, to discuss the role Canberra can play in Greater Western Sydney's development, please build your applause to a grand crescendo as I ask the Minister for Emergency Management and Cities, Senator the Honourable Jenny McAllister, to the stage. Thank you, Minister. Hello.
Thank you. You'll all have to forgive me a little bit. It's been a heady night of legislating last night, and it meant very limited sleep and a very early morning to get up and get on the highway to get here. But it's all really important, as you probably heard from Minister O'Neill this morning, some really important things legislated that will make a real difference to a lot of people. We are gathering, of course, on the traditional lands of the Darug people. So I pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and to any First Nations people who are here today. Thanks for the introduction, and congratulations to Adam and to Chris and to the Western Sydney Leadership Dialogue for bringing everybody together. And I actually really want to start with that idea, because I know and I can see before me many of the people who have spent decades proudly advocating for Western Sydney. We are all the beneficiaries in Sydney and nationally of all of that effort. Australia's success is so closely tied to the fortunes of this place. Greater Western Sydney is one of Australia's biggest economic zones. It's one of our fastest growing populations. It's one of our most culturally diverse regions. So there actually isn't anywhere better for me to launch the government's new National Urban Policy, and I want to talk to you a bit about that today, because the document that we're releasing today is the first National Urban Policy since 2011. Now, I will resist the temptation to be overly political and reflect on why it is so long between drinks, but I do want to touch a little bit on the importance that cities policy has played for successive Labor governments. Now, Western Sydney has a proud history, a proud record of sending Prime Ministers to Canberra. So in 1972, Gough Whitlam gives his famous It's Time speech, and it's just a bit up the M4 from here in Blacktown, and he says, "A national government which cuts itself off from responsibility for the nation's cities is cutting itself off from the nation's real life. A national government which has nothing to say about cities has nothing relevant or enduring to say about the nation or the nation's future." Now, since then, Labor has had a lot to say about cities, and Prime Minister Albanese has been at the heart of those conversations for many years. So he spoke about urban policy in his first speech to Parliament in 1996. He was the Minister for Infrastructure that created Infrastructure Australia. He was the Minister that last delivered a national urban policy in 2011. And at the last election, he committed a Labor government to engage and to revitalise national urban policy. So as part of that agenda that Anthony so clearly laid out, I am very pleased to launch the second national urban policy today. Some of the challenges that confronted Gough and his colleagues remain. But of course, since then, there have been very significant developments that demand new thinking in urban policy. The global economy is changing, there are new technologies, there are new economic activities that would have been unimaginable to Gough back then. The pandemic has brought changed work patterns and changed expectations. Our population is ageing, our urban areas are increasingly facing the effects of climate change, some of which are now locked in and are unavoidable. Now, the Commonwealth has a range of levers, and we can use those to better support our cities, to support our communities, and take the pressure off families. But they don't sit under a single minister. Actually, they're found across portfolios: infrastructure and transport, housing, social services, health, education, industry and science, skills, environment, migration, energy and climate change. That list is actually endless, but you kind of get the point. You will understand better than most the benefits that come from a coordinated effort across those domains. But you probably understand too just how hard it is to actually make it happen. So the Commonwealth also recognises that aside from that horizontal coordination that we need to undertake, the key to good urban policy is cooperation with other governments and with the community and with the private sector. We have to work together. And so the National Urban Policy really aims to reflect that. And in developing the policy, we had very good advisors, and I'd like to record my thanks to all of the experts, but all of the stakeholders too, who were instrumental in the policy development. I want to particularly acknowledge Professor Barbara Norman, and she's in the audience today. She is a globally renowned expert. She has been such an energetic chair of the Government's Urban Policy Forum, and she has done a terrific job in shepherding this thinking. Thank you, Barbara, so much, and thank you for being here. I'd also like to acknowledge Ahuri's Michael Fotheringham, who has also been part of the Policy Forum. Can I acknowledge too that I'm recently in this role? And in fact, much of the work was shepherded by my colleague, Catherine King, who did this before I took the city's portfolio on in July. But there were three big themes that emerged in the process of developing the National Urban Policy. And as I was reading through the sessions that you'll all be engaging with today, I was struck how relevant these themes are to the agenda for Greater Western Sydney. The first, of course, is livable and equitable. If we want urban places to be vibrant and welcoming, we need to support everyone to have access to the basics of a decent life, things like healthcare, education, work. Now, in my lifetime, we have seen the impact that big investments, like the decision to create the University of Western Sydney, have had. And housing is at the heart of the challenge today, and I know that you heard from Minister O'Neill this morning, who is still in Canberra dealing with the outcomes of the Senate legislating process tonight. But our government does have a $32 billion plan to build more homes, help more people buy homes, massively increase rent assistance and get more social and affordable housing into the system. Claire has worked so hard to get that housing legislation through the Senate this week, and her predecessor Julie Collins also. And as Claire has said, none of these schemes are a silver bullet, but they make a real difference. And Help to Buy will support 40,000 Australians who might otherwise miss out on a first home. The Property Council has estimated that Build to Rent can deliver more than 80,000 new rental properties. I think we're clear about the scale of the challenge. This housing challenge has been building for 30 years. Untangling it is going to take time, and it's going to require us to pull on a lot of levers. The second theme is productive and innovative. Now, our cities are powerhouses of economies. Good urban policy should ensure that they continue to be so and to drive prosperity. It asks us to invest in the hard infrastructure, trade, freight and transport, but also the soft infrastructure of a skilled and productive workforce. Now, the government has committed over $17.3 billion to Western Sydney over the next decade under the Infrastructure Investment Program. So alongside road and rail projects, this investment will help build the Western Sydney International Airport. That's a project that was first discussed in the 1940s. It's now almost here. It has already created 10,000 jobs. Now, the construction alone is a vast amount of economic activity, but it pales when we consider the future. This is an investment that will bring compounding returns for years to come. And the final theme in the policy is sustainable and resilient. Now, our climate is changing. Our cities have to support our efforts to reach net zero, but they also have to adapt to the effects of climate that are unfortunately already locked in. Now, I spent a lot of time thinking about these issues when I was in my previous role as Assistant Minister for Climate and Energy, and Western Sydney has so much to gain from getting this right. We can invest in nature-based solutions that reduce our exposure to risk and protect Australia's biodiversity. Better building codes can encourage dwellings that can manage heat. Consumer energy resources allow families and businesses to take control of their energy use using solar panels and batteries and smart energy to power energy-efficient air conditioners. Now, I know that over the course of today, you will have a chance to think about many of these questions, big and small. I've touched on housing, climate change, productivity, and I am grateful for that because this is a shared task. We need all of your ingenuity and creativity over the coming years. Now, the National Urban Policy actually doesn't pretend to have all the answers. It sets out a pathway for collaboration on shared goals. And realising those goals requires you, the people who know your communities, who've advocated for your communities, and who have hard-won experience of what works and what doesn't, to talk to us about your perspectives and your views. And events like today are incredibly important to the government and to the communities that you represent. I really wish you the very best, and I'm looking forward to our fireside chat at this warm hearth.
Settle in. Thank you, Minister. It's been a big week and a long night. Appreciate you making the trek down this morning down the Hume to Sydney. I want to start by, you mentioned Gough and the Prime Minister, two, I suppose, well-known identities that have built a really strong Labor reputation around cities. You're new to the role. How do you want to be seen? How do you want the portfolio to be seen?
A couple of things. I did say in my remarks that I was going to avoid being too partisan, but I do think that there is a particularly proud Labor legacy of thinking about this at a national level. That's not universal, but for the most part, coalition parties have not seen these questions as being of national significance. They've acknowledged them as important in state contexts, but for Labor, there is a consistent theme that this is an area where we wish to lean in. So that's our starting point. I think the most important thing, though, is to realise that the challenge for cities changes. So when we last had an urban policy, it was focused on livable, productive and sustainable. They were sort of the three goals. Many circumstances have changed since then, and it means that we need to update our thinking about that. And so now we are talking about sustainable and resilient, because there are many challenges that we need to think about, including urban heat, that we actually do need to take seriously if we want to meet our objectives as a community. We are very directly seeking to put in place the policy settings that will allow us to have a more innovative economy and an economy with more complexity and depth than the one we have now. When we talk about a future made in Australia, it's very deliberately about leveraging the economic opportunities and advantages that we see, and there are many of those are anchored in Western Sydney. We need to make sure that our approach to cities and our thinking about how cities function reflects where our economy and the global economy is up to now. And I guess finally, we want our cities to be inclusive as well as livable. Part of that is about justice. Of course, we want more equitable and inclusive communities. Part of it is also economic. One of the great advantages that Australia has is a vast multicultural community that is incredibly well connected in a people-to-people way, in a business-to-business way, and I think we should think more regularly and with greater focus about what that offers for us in terms of our economic future and our future in our region.
Yeah. Congratulations on the policy. I know it's been in the works for a while. Those themes you mentioned, particularly around urban heat, and we've had a lot of discussion around that this week.
It's been a hot week.
Inclusivity, equity, all things that we often talk about for Western Sydney. Without saying that this document talks directly to Western Sydney, it's hard to ignore that there are a lot of messages in there that are important for the region. What are you, pulling out some of the key bits, what do those elements look like, and what does it mean for the residents of Western Sydney?
think one of the interesting things about Western Sydney is the growing sense of a clear and distinct identity that runs right across economic and social questions. And I was quite sincere in congratulating the people who are around the tables here who have been very personally involved in advocating for the emergence of that very distinct identity. I think that's really important because it acknowledges some of the strengths that might otherwise be overlooked if we only looked at some parts of the traditional parts of the city that have been areas of focus. One of the things we have a big opportunity to do is ensure that we support the New South Wales State Government in growing out the multipolar nature of Sydney. Sydney's quite unique in having successfully achieved a multipolar city, and with the opening of the airport, we actually are at the beginning of that job, not the conclusion of it. There is more work to do to make sure that all of that opportunity that comes about from having a connected Western Sydney that can then leverage the inherent strengths of Western Sydney, we have to make sure that we actually realise all of those opportunities.
One of the features of City's portfolio is that it has overlap with other portfolios, and we heard from Minister for Housing earlier. How are you working with your colleagues so that your direction and your emphasis is sort of met with, particularly in places like Western Sydney where development's happening and things like blue space, green space, public amenity, also complementing future development and growth in the region?
A little while back, well before I went into the Parliament, I had the good fortune to work in a infrastructure advisory firm for a little while. And one of the things that I learnt there was how significant the underlying infrastructure really is, and you'll see a lot of that in the policies that the government is rolling out. I think Claire will have spoken to you this morning about some of the ways that we're seeking to support state governments to bring on new housing developments through supporting underlying infrastructure. That's a really good example of the transport and infrastructure portfolio linking in with the housing portfolio to make sure that we can deliver an integrated outcome. I am increasingly interested in what I might do with my colleagues in the economic portfolios. I'm thinking about, Minister Husick in industry, Minister Ayres in the Future Made in Australia portfolio, Minister Farrell in the trade portfolio, because the opportunity that is presented for Greater Western Sydney and lots of cities around the country is to really leverage this changing economy and make sure that we give all of the opportunity, we capture all those opportunities. Western Sydney is really special in having a very skilled workforce across a range of different categories of skill, and as I indicated, a really multicultural workforce. I think those things position this part of the city incredibly well to be a participant in a changing economy that becomes more complex, but it's going to take a little bit of coordination effort across the state and the Commonwealth to make that come about.
On that coordination piece, one of the things we've seen historically in Western Sydney is that linkage back into local government as well. Is that part of the conversation? Is that part of your mandate over the coming months and years?
I think looking for opportunities to bring local government into the story when we're doing precinct-based work is really important. So we've got two programs that are really directly targeting that. We've had the Thriving Communities program. We've also got the Urban Partnerships and Precincts program open at the moment. Both of those seek to really directly look at local community opportunities to build from a bottom up, the kind of sense of place and precinct that can make a really big difference to local economic and community activity. Partnership is kind of a habit as much as anything else though. And I think in the last government we were sometimes saw the Australian government look for conflict rather than collaboration. We've worked really hard to re-establish those collaborative relationships with the states and territories of all political flavours. That's a real focus for me. We obviously convene the planning ministers very regularly, and we look to them to support us in integrating the insights from local councils into that thinking as well.
On the topic of precincts, one final one. Are there any specific areas, you mentioned the airport and the Aerotropolis, are there any specific precincts or areas that you'd want to be more focused and targeted in terms of, the role that you might play in shaping some of the urban outcomes?
I do think maintaining focus on the multipolar nature of Sydney is one of the things that we can do to assist state governments. I mean, the state government here is obviously thinking very hard about the shape of the city. They've got some very big transport projects underway. We obviously support many of those, but I think just really helping the state government implement their vision rather than trying to impose one over the top is one of the ways that we can be a good partner. Listening hard, thinking about what's needed, being disciplined about the way we provide support, but fundamentally trying to partner together to bring about a good outcome for the residents.
Well, I think that's a very smart approach, and thank you, Minister, for your time. I know it's been a long night. Ladies and gentlemen, please thank Minister Jenny McAllister.